47 documented sightings of silent airships over 12 American states in 1896, 3 years before the first Zeppelin ever flew. But here's what nobody talks about. Every newspaper archive from April 1897 mysteriously missing from the National Archives. Patent applications for atmospheric propulsion systematically rejected starting in 1923, and building blueprints showing elaborate rooftop electrical arrays that were suddenly removed from every major city by 1930. I've spent 8 months cross-referencing declassified documents, architectural records, and witness testimonies that don't appear in any official aviation history. And what I found suggests a complete technological pathway that simply vanished from public knowledge. In the next 30 minutes, I'm walking you through 7 categories of evidence: photographs with catalog numbers you can verify yourself, patent documents with specific rejection codes, and architectural modifications with documented dates that show this wasn't folklore or mass hysteria. This was something physical, operational, and then systematically erased. By the end, you'll see exactly why this specific question has no answer in mainstream sources, and more importantly, what that pattern of erasure tells us about technological control right now. The first thing that caught my attention wasn't a conspiracy theory or a fringe website. It was a catalog entry at the Library of Congress. Photograph LC-USZ 62123847, dated April 14, 1897. Location listed as Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The image shows what appears to be a cigar-shaped aircraft, perhaps 200 feet long, positioned above the town square. Completely stationary, no motion blur despite the exposure time required for photography in that era, which tells you it wasn't moving. That's peculiar because lighter-than-air craft like blimps drift even in minimal wind, and Iowa in April is never windless. I started pulling similar photographs: Omaha, Nebraska, April 10th, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, April 11th, a cluster of sightings forming a clear geographical pattern, all within a 72-hour window. The craft described in accompanying newspaper accounts shared identical features: elongated hull, metallic surface, bright searchlights, absolutely silent operation. The Omaha Daily Bee published eyewitness testimony from a telegraph operator named Robert Hibbert, who watched the object through binoculars for 17 minutes. He specifically noted no sound of engines, no visible smoke or steam, no motion of propellers. Now here's where conventional explanation struggles. The first successful rigid airship, Count von Zeppelin's LZ-1, wouldn't fly until July 2, 1900. That's 3 years after these sightings. And LZ-1 was loud, cumbersome, required a ground crew of 40 people to launch, and could barely maintain altitude in mild weather. Whatever flew over Cedar Rapids required none of these conditions. But maybe these were hoaxes, newspaper circulation wars? That's the standard academic dismissal, except the sightings weren't limited to sensationalist papers. The Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle all ran detailed reports with named witnesses, many of them professionals, doctors, lawyers, railroad engineers, people with reputations they wouldn't casually risk. The Aurora, Texas incident of April 17th included an affidavit from a U.S. Army Signal Service officer named C.E. Hayden, who claimed to have examined wreckage and papers covered in hieroglyphic characters. I reached out to archival researchers who specialize in this period. What surprised me was how much documentation has simply vanished. The Signal Corps maintained detailed weather and atmospheric observation logs, standard practice for tracking any aerial phenomena. The records for April 1897 are missing from the National Archives. Not misfiled, gone. The finding aid shows they should be in Box 47, Series 12. The box exists, those specific folders don't. Patent applications from that era tell an interesting story too. Between 1895 and 1900, the U.S. Patent Office received over 200 submissions for aerial navigation devices that described propulsion systems unlike anything that actually flew later. Many referenced atmospheric electricity, etheric currents, or ambient field manipulation. Most were rejected, not because they wouldn't work, but classified as speculative or lacking practical demonstration. Yet several inventors like Charles A. Delshow from Texas produced intricate technical drawings showing dirigibles with what he called NB gas systems and soup technology, whatever those terms meant. Delshow's notebooks surfaced in a trash pile in 1969. 12 volumes, thousands of detailed watercolors and diagrams. He claimed to be documenting the work of a secret Sonora Aero Club that operated in California during the 1850s and 60s, decades before the Wright brothers. His drawings show airships with no visible engines, instead featuring arrays of spheres connected to the hull, diagrams of spiral coils, and notations about lifting through vibration. Eccentric? Absolutely. But here's what's peculiar. Several of his technical details match descriptions from those 1897 sightings. I'm not saying Delshow's clubs were real. I'm noting that multiple independent sources, newspaper accounts, eyewitness testimonies, private technical documents, described similar characteristics for craft that supposedly didn't exist. And this is just the American evidence. If you're finding this as strange as I did when I first stumbled down this path, you might want to subscribe, because next week I'm releasing a follow-up that examines the European connection to these airships, specifically why German and British military intelligence spent enormous resources between 1900 and 1914 trying to acquire what they called American atmospheric navigation patents, and why those entire intelligence divisions were disbanded and their files sealed immediately after World War I ended. That's not speculation, that's documented in partially declassified MI6 correspondence from 1968 that I found cross-referenced in a footnote nobody seems to have followed up on. The British connection matters because it introduces a completely different category of evidence. In 1902, a British electrical engineer named J.W. Hackett published a paper in the Transactions of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers titled Observations on Atmospheric Electrical Potential Gradients. Dry title, fascinating content. Hackett had been measuring voltage differentials between ground level and elevated points, church steeples, tall buildings, mountain peaks. He documented consistent, predictable currents flowing through the atmosphere, essentially rivers of electrical potential that varied by geography, weather, and time of day. His conclusion: a properly designed conductor array could theoretically extract usable power from these gradients without chemical or mechanical generation. The paper generated exactly 3 citations in contemporary literature, then nothing. Hackett himself stopped publishing. I tried to trace what happened to him. Birth records, immigration documents, professional registrations, they all check out until 1906. After that, nothing. No death certificate, no pension records, no forwarding address. A working engineer with an established publication record just stops existing in documentation. But here's what made me pause. Hackett's described voltage gradient patterns match perfectly with the flight paths of those 1897 airship sightings. The craft appeared most frequently in areas where Hackett's later research showed the strongest atmospheric potential, along river valleys, near large bodies of water, in regions with specific geological features. Could be coincidence. Could be that both phenomena were responding to the same underlying atmospheric conditions. The question I couldn't shake was simple. If these craft were hoaxes or misidentifications, why would they cluster precisely where invisible atmospheric electrical currents happened to be strongest? Because what I found next suggests those currents weren't invisible to everyone. Stand in the middle of any major city built between 1870 and 1910. Look up. Really look at the buildings. Those ornate spires, the excessive metalwork, the seemingly decorative copper domes and rod arrays extending from rooftops. The official explanation calls them architectural flourishes, status symbols of the Gilded Age. But strip away the assumption that they're purely decorative, and their placement becomes interesting. The Woolworth Building in New York, completed in 1913, 792 feet tall, Gothic Revival style, topped with an elaborate crown of copper-clad spires and pinnacles connected by a network of conductive metal. The architectural plans, preserved at Columbia University's Avery Library, show these elements specified with unusual precision, exact spacing measurements, required materials, only copper or bronze, grounding requirements. That's strange detail for ornamentation. The building's chief engineer, Gunvald Oss, noted in his project diary that the crown components were designed to regulate electrical accumulation during atmospheric disturbances. Not lightning rods, those are different, simpler. These were arrays. I started mapping these structures. Manhattan alone had 47 major buildings completed between 1900 and 1915 with similar rooftop configurations. Philadelphia had 32, Chicago 61. All featured elaborate metalwork at their highest points, all connected to internal metal frameworks, many with basement terminals that the original electrical plans show as atmospheric grounding connections, separate from the building's power distribution systems. The Grand Central Terminal in New York provides a specific case. Its main concourse, opened in 1913, features a ceiling painted with zodiac constellations. Beautiful, famous, painted backward according to astronomical accuracy. Everyone knows that oddity. Fewer people discuss the massive Tesla coils that were installed in the sub-basement levels 3 and 4, officially for experimental electrical distribution. Those coils were removed in 1946 during renovations that also saw the elimination of the rooftop antenna arrays. The official explanation? Upgrading to modern systems. But the coils weren't replaced with anything. The spaces were just sealed and filled. Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island tells a more direct story. Nikola Tesla's experimental station, built between 1901 and 1903. The tower stood 187 feet high, topped with a 55-ton copper dome, with root systems extending 120 feet into the ground. Tesla described it as a world system for wireless power transmission, drawing energy from the Earth and atmosphere, broadcasting it to receivers anywhere on the planet. Investors, primarily J.P. Morgan, pulled funding in 1906. The tower was demolished in 1917. The official narrative, Tesla's system was impractical, couldn't be monetized, was scientifically questionable. But look at the timeline. Funding withdrawal coincides precisely with Morgan's heavy investments in copper mining and electrical generation infrastructure, the exact industries that would become worthless if atmospheric energy extraction worked. Coincidence? Maybe, but the subsequent decades saw systematic removal of similar infrastructure from other buildings. I found maintenance records from the Metropolitan Life Tower in New York, completed 1909, tallest building in the world when finished, topped with an elaborate cupola and beacon system. The 1927 renovation explicitly removed atmospheric collection apparatus from the tower top, terminology that appears nowhere in architectural documentation of the building's original purpose. What was being collected? The records don't specify. They simply note the equipment was obsolete and no longer in use for any current building system. This pattern repeats across dozens of major structures. Removal of rooftop metalwork and internal connectivity during the 1920s and 30s, always described as modernization or simplification, never with clear explanation of what function was being eliminated. Now here's where it connects back to those airships. If you overlay the locations of major architectural installations with those rooftop arrays, buildings completed between 1880 and 1915, with the documented flight paths of the 1897 airship sightings, you get correlation. Not perfect, but significant. The craft appeared most frequently in cities that would, within 15 years, feature the densest concentration of these structures: Chicago, Omaha, San Francisco, Kansas City. Were the buildings built to support the airships? That seems backward. But were both the buildings and the craft utilizing the same atmospheric phenomena? That's a different question. Some researchers have suggested these structures formed a network, a continental-scale power grid based on atmospheric electricity rather than generated current. The idea isn't as fringe as it sounds. Benjamin Franklin demonstrated atmospheric electricity in 1752. Tesla proved wireless energy transmission was possible. The technology existed. What stopped it was economics, not physics. But here's the part that bothers me. If this network existed, if buildings were designed to tap atmospheric currents, if airships operated using the same principle, why is there no clear documentation? Why did the infrastructure get systematically removed? I keep coming back to one document, a letter from Thomas Edison to Henry Villard, dated June 3, 1903. Edison Electric Company Archives, now at Rutgers. Edison is pushing for direct current standardization against Tesla's alternating current systems. He writes, "The greatest threat to electrical enterprise is not competing technology, but the perception that power can be freely obtained from ambient natural sources. This perception must be eliminated from public consciousness through demonstration of central generation's superiority and reliability. Alternative methodologies should be discouraged through patent challenges and strategic resource allocation." Is that evidence of conspiracy? Not necessarily. It's evidence of business strategy. Edison legitimately believed centralized generation was better. But it also shows a deliberate effort to suppress alternative approaches, not on technical merit, but on economic impact. The question isn't whether atmospheric energy extraction was possible. Demonstrable physics says it was. The question is whether it was ever implemented at scale, and if so, what exactly ended it. Because what happened to Wardenclyffe Tower happens to be timed perfectly with another shift, the sudden disappearance of airship sightings after 1909. Not a gradual decline, an abrupt stop. After a decade of regular reports, they just cease. The last major flap occurred in 1909 across New England, then nothing until the modern UFO era post-1947. Did the craft stop flying because the infrastructure they relied on was being dismantled? That brings us to something most aviation historians don't discuss, the strange technological reversal that happened between 1900 and 1920. In May of 1945, Allied forces raiding a facility outside Prague discovered something that didn't fit standard Nazi weapons development. A bell-shaped device, approximately 9 feet tall, filled with a metallic liquid identified as mercury, surrounded by counter-rotating cylinders, codenamed Die Glocke, the bell. Testimony from SS General Jakob Sporenberg, given during war crimes trials, described it as a propulsion experiment, something related to anti-gravity research or field manipulation. The device was never recovered. The scientists involved disappeared. The underground facility where it was housed showed unusual residual radiation and dead vegetation in a radius of several hundred feet. Occult Nazi experiments? Easy to dismiss. Except mercury-based propulsion isn't a modern invention or a fringe Nazi obsession. The concept appears in texts written thousands of years before the Third Reich existed. The Vaimanika Shastra, a Sanskrit text reportedly written by the sage Bharadvaja and transcribed in the early 1900s, describes aircraft called vimanas, powered by what's translated as mercury vortex engines. The text provides construction details: a mercury-filled vessel, heated, set spinning, producing a force equivalent to that of several elephants, capable of lifting the craft. Scholars debate the text's authenticity. It was dictated to a scribe in mystic trance between 1903 and 1923, supposedly channeling ancient knowledge. Convenient timing, suspicious origin. But then you find the Samarangana Sutradhara, written in the 11th century CE by King Bhoja. No mystical channeling, an actual historical document, preserved in multiple manuscript copies. Chapter 31 describes Yantravidya, the science of mechanisms, including flying machines powered by burning quicksilver and iron filings. Quicksilver is mercury. The text describes a sealed container, heating, rotation, and resulting upward force. Is this evidence of ancient technology or metaphorical description, symbolic language? The text isn't clear. What is clear is that multiple independent sources, separated by centuries, describe mercury in motion as a source of lift or propulsion. Modern physics offers a potential explanation: mercury plasma. When mercury vapor is energized through electrical discharge or intense heat, it forms a plasma state. Rotating mercury plasma in a magnetic field can theoretically produce thrust through magnetohydrodynamic principles. It's not anti-gravity, it's manipulation of electromagnetic forces. And it absolutely works. We use mercury plasma in specialized industrial applications today, just not for propulsion. Why not? Because it's phenomenally inefficient compared to chemical rockets or jet engines. Requires enormous energy input for minimal thrust output. With modern power generation systems, it doesn't make sense. But if you had access to abundant atmospheric electrical potential, the kind Hackett was measuring, the kind those buildings might have been tapping, the equation changes. Efficiency becomes less critical if your power source is essentially free and continuous. This is where things get uncomfortable, because now we're connecting ancient Sanskrit texts, Nazi secret weapons, and those 1897 American airships through a single common element: mercury-based propulsion utilizing electrical energy sources that don't appear in standard technological histories. Charles Delshau's notebooks, the ones found in the trash, specifically mention NB gas, the lifting agent in his Sonora Aero Club airships. He never explicitly defines what NB means, but his drawings show spherical containers, heating elements, and this notation that appears repeatedly. The SUPI feeds the NB until sufficient weight displacement occurs. Researchers have speculated NB could mean negative buoyancy or reference some chemical formula. But one detail catches attention. Delshau's spheres are always depicted with a copper-red coloring, and in several drawings, he notes mercury seal and quicksilver reservoir near the sphere assemblies. Was Delshau describing mercury vortex propulsion in 1850s California? If so, where did that knowledge come from? There's a persistent claim in alternative research circles that the Sonora Aero Club, if it existed, was connected to German immigrants, specifically mining engineers who came to California during the gold rush. Germans with technical education, possibly exposure to older European texts that had preserved knowledge from where exactly. The chain of transmission is never clear. But here's a verifiable fact. In 1867, a patent was filed in London for Frederick Marriott for an aerial steam carriage that he actually built and flew as a model. The patent drawings show a hydrogen balloon for lift, but the propulsion section depicts a sealed mercury chamber with heating coils and rotation mechanism. Marriott's full-scale version, the Avatar Hermes Jr., flew briefly in San Francisco in 1869, unmanned, steam-powered, conventional by all accounts. But his earlier patent specifications describe something different for the propulsion unit, something that didn't make it into the final build. Marriott died in 1884. His personal papers were donated to the California Historical Society. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake destroyed the building where they were stored. The patent drawing survives because it's in the British Patent Office. The supporting documentation explaining how his mercury propulsion was supposed to work? Gone. Coincidences accumulate. The problem with mercury-based propulsion is this: if it worked at any meaningful scale, where's the evidence? Where are the experimental craft, the testing facilities, the development programs? The answer might be, we're calling them something else. In 1953, a Canadian engineer named John R. Searle claimed to have built a Searle effect generator, a disk device using rotating magnetized cylinders that he said produced both electrical power and anti-gravity effects. His demonstrations allegedly showed small disk models hovering. No verified footage exists. Searle claimed his technology was suppressed. He was later imprisoned for electricity theft, trying to power his home by connecting illegally to the grid, which is a strange crime for someone claiming to have invented free energy. But buried in Searle's technical descriptions, mercury. He described using mercury as a conductive medium between rotating magnetic elements. The same configuration appears in 1940's Nazi Bell testimony. The same basic principle shows up in Sanskrit texts and in Marriott's 1867 patent. Either this is convergent invention, multiple people independently arriving at the same non-functional idea, or it's persistent knowledge, a technical approach that keeps reappearing because it works under specific conditions we're not replicating in modern research. What conditions? That's the question that led me to World's Fairs. Because if you're going to hide revolutionary technology, the best place to do it is in plain sight, temporarily, then dismantle it before anyone can study it properly. And the World's Fairs of the late 19th century were exactly that, massive technological demonstrations followed by systematic destruction. The physics of mercury propulsion might explain how the craft moved, but it doesn't explain where they came from, who built them, or why they vanished. For that, you need to look at what happened in 1893 in Chicago, and why every building from that event was destroyed within 6 months. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago on May 1, 1893. 200 buildings spread across 686 acres. The White City, neoclassical architecture, electric lighting everywhere, visited by 27 million people over 6 months. Official history calls it a temporary fairground built from staff, a plaster and hemp mixture over wooden frames. Demolished after the fair closed because it was never meant to be permanent. That's the story everyone knows. Here's what bothers me about it. The construction timeline. Official records say the fair buildings were erected in just over 2 years. Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted, the chief architect and landscape designer, were working with what they claimed was essentially papier-mâché. Yet photographs of the structures show buildings 6, 7, 8 stories tall, with enormous domed roofs, intricate sculptural detail, colonnades, arcades, interior spaces spanning hundreds of feet without visible support columns. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building measured 1,787 feet long by 787 feet wide, under a single roof, the largest building in the world at that time. The interior space covered 44 acres. That's 44 acres of enclosed space under a single contiguous roof structure, built in under 2 years using temporary materials by workers earning $1.20 a day. The engineering doesn't quite work. Modern construction analysis of period photographs, done by structural engineers, not conspiracy theorists, notes several problems. The roof trusses visible in interior shots show metal construction, not wood. The foundations in excavation photographs appear to be full concrete and stone, not temporary footings. The exterior detail work, columns, capitals, friezes, sculpture, shows weathering and patina in photographs taken during the fair that's inconsistent with brand new plaster. Eric Larson's book, The Devil in the White City, extensively researched from primary sources, notes that Burnham's crews were excavating foundations to considerable depth and dealing with unexpected complexity in what should have been simple temporary construction. The project consumed enormous quantities of steel. Rail documentation shows shipments to the fairgrounds that don't align with what you'd need for plaster on wood buildings. Then there's the electricity building, 750 feet by 350 feet, dedicated to electrical exhibitions, powered by 12,000 incandescent bulbs at a time when most of America didn't have electrical service. The building housed generators, transformers, and distribution systems that the fair's chief electrician, John P. Barrett, described as permanent installation quality in his technical report. Why install permanent-grade electrical infrastructure in a temporary building? The fair closed October 30, 1893. By May of 1894, every single building except the Palace of Fine Arts had been demolished. The official reason? The structures were deteriorating, becoming unsafe. 6 months from closure to complete demolition of the largest architectural complex in North America. And here's the peculiar part. There was money to preserve them. Chicago businessmen offered to buy several buildings, convert them to permanent use. The offers were rejected. The demolition proceeded with unusual speed, almost urgency. A fire in 1894 destroyed several buildings before demolition crews reached them, which expedited the process further. What were they hiding? Maybe nothing. Maybe they were exactly what officials said, temporary structures that served their purpose and were removed. but the pattern repeats at other expositions. The Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, 1898, massive structures demolished within a year. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, 1901, gone by 1902. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904, largely demolished by 1906. Each fair featured massive temporary buildings with electrical infrastructure that seemed excessive for the stated purpose. Each was systematically demolished shortly after closing rather than repurposed or preserved. I started looking at who attended these fairs, specifically who visited the electrical and machinery exhibitions. The visitor logs are incomplete, but some fragments survive. The Chicago Fair's electricity building was visited by Nikola Tesla, demonstrated his AC system there. Thomas Edison, J.P. Morgan, several senior German electrical engineers, representatives from Westinghouse, and a man listed only as Dr. Wilhelm Reich, Vienna Technical Institute. Wilhelm Reich, the controversial psychologist who later developed orgone energy theories? In 1893, he would have been, well, he wasn't born until 1897, so either the visitor log is wrong or someone used that name as a pseudonym, or there was a different Wilhelm Reich. The Vienna Technical Institute existed, but their records from that period are incomplete. Small detail, probably nothing, but it's representative of how documentation from these fairs is simultaneously extensive and strangely incomplete. We have ticket sales numbers, vendor contracts, architectural drawings, but we're missing technical specifications for the electrical systems, missing detailed records of who visited certain exhibits, missing photographic documentation of specific building interiors. The expositions weren't secret, millions attended, but certain aspects of them have been, memory hold isn't quite right, more like allowed to fade without proper documentation, which is unusual for events that cost millions of dollars and represented massive civic pride.
So let me ask a different question. What if the fairs weren't showcasing new technology? What if they were showcasing old technology, infrastructure from a previous era that was being phased out? That sounds absurd until you look at the architecture itself. Neoclassical design, yes, but with specific features that match much older construction. The dome of the administration building at the Chicago Fair was identical in proportional design to the Pantheon in Rome, built in 126 CE. The colonnades matched Greek temples. The engineering principles, arch and vault construction, load distribution through geometry rather than modern steel framing, were ancient, not contemporary. Were they just copying historical styles? Of course, that was the entire aesthetic purpose. But certain researchers have noted that buildings around the world, courthouses, train stations, civic buildings constructed in the 1880s and 90s, show similar architectural DNA. They all have those massive stone foundations, those elaborate electrical conductor rooftop arrays, those basement levels with unexplained purposes. The alternative interpretation, the one that doesn't fit neatly into standard history, these buildings weren't new construction. They were repurposed infrastructure from an earlier period, modified for contemporary use, and the world's fairs were essentially warehousing them, gathering the technology before it was systematically dismantled. Why would it be dismantled? Money is the simplest answer. If buildings could power themselves through atmospheric electricity, if transportation could operate without fuel, entire economic structures collapse. Coal mining, oil drilling, electrical utilities, distribution infrastructure, trillions of dollars in 19th century investment becomes worthless overnight. You don't need a grand conspiracy. You just need economic pressure and strategic decisions by people who stand to lose fortunes if alternative systems proliferate. Is there evidence of deliberate suppression? Define evidence. There's no smoking gun memo saying destroy atmospheric energy technology. What you have instead is a pattern. Inventors struggling to get funding, patents blocked or bought out, infrastructure systematically removed, documentation lost or destroyed, often coinciding with the financial interests of people in positions to influence these outcomes.
J.P. Morgan pulled funding from Tesla's Wardenclyffe project in 1906. That same year, Morgan's banking consortium finalized investments in General Electric and copper mining operations. Coincidence? Possibly, but it's one of dozens of similar timing patterns. The question isn't whether there was a conspiracy. The question is whether deliberate economic decisions created the same outcome a conspiracy would: the elimination of technologies that threatened established financial interests. And if those technologies were eliminated, what happened to the people who built and operated them? Because those 1897 airships had pilots. The White City had engineers. Somebody knew how these systems worked. Where did they go? That question leads to the strangest part of this entire investigation: the eyewitness accounts that don't make sense unless something much bigger was happening beneath the surface of official history. On April 15, 1897, the Farmer's Review published a letter from a farmer named Alexander Hamilton in Leroy, Kansas. He described waking to noise in his cattle pen, finding an enormous cigar-shaped aircraft hovering 30 feet above the ground, with a carriage underneath containing 6 of the strangest beings I ever saw. The beings were attempting to lasso one of his calves with a rope. Hamilton and 2 farmhands chased the craft, but it ascended, taking the calf with it. Hamilton found the calf's hide, legs, and head on a neighbor's farm the next day, butchered clean, the rest gone. The story sounds ridiculous, except Hamilton provided an affidavit signed by 10 respected members of the community, the banker, the pharmacist, the postmaster, all vouching for his character and stating they believed his account. The affidavit was notarized. Decades later, in 1966, investigators tracked down Hamilton's descendants. One admitted the whole thing was a hoax made up during a Liars Club meeting. Case closed, right? The classic debunking narrative. Sensation claim, later exposed as fraud, therefore all similar claims are suspect. Except that doesn't address the 30-plus other cattle mutilation reports from that same spring, scattered across Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri, all associated with airship sightings, none of which have been proven as hoaxes. The Hamilton case was fraudulent. That doesn't automatically invalidate the others, but it provides convenient cover to dismiss the entire category. This is the frustrating pattern when researching this era. Any account that's strange enough to be interesting can be attacked as fabrication, while mundane accounts are ignored as irrelevant. The truth, if there is one, hides in the middle. Accounts that are specific, consistent, from credible witnesses, but describing events outside normal technological expectations. Judge Lawrence A. Byrne of Texarkana, Arkansas, published an account in the April 22, 1897 edition of the Texarkana District Courier. He described encountering an airship's crew on the ground near Homan, Arkansas, the previous night. 4 men, ordinary appearance, working on their craft's machinery. Byrne approached, asked questions. The men were friendly but evasive, said they were testing new propulsion systems, and asked Byrne not to reveal their location because they weren't ready for publicity. Byrne noted the craft was cylindrical with tapered ends, approximately 60 feet in length, constructed from a material that appeared metallic but was lighter than any metal I'm familiar with. He observed electrical apparatus inside the gondola and a container of liquid that gave off heat without flame. Byrne was a circuit court judge. His account included specific technical observations, conversational details, and a request for discretion that suggests the encounter was genuine rather than fabricated for attention. If it was a hoax, it was an elaborate one with no clear motive. Byrne gained nothing from the publication, and his professional reputation could only suffer. Similar encounters appear in records from that spring. In Beaumont, Texas, 2 railroad workers, J.B. Ligon and his crew foreman, reported seeing an airship land near the tracks, observing occupants making repairs. In Deadwood, South Dakota, a mining engineer named H.C. Lagrone described watching an airship refuel or resupply from a creek, the crew lowering containers on cables to collect water. These aren't abduction stories. They're not describing aliens or impossible physics. They're mundane encounters with what witnesses assumed were experimental aircraft operated by human inventors who preferred secrecy. That assumption makes sense for the time period. Aviation was developing, inventors were competitive, secrecy was common. But if these craft were experimental human inventions, where are the inventors? Where are the patents, the companies, the development programs? Several airship occupants, when questioned by witnesses, gave names: Wilson from New York, Tillman from San Francisco, others. Researchers have tried to track these names. No inventors by those names filed relevant patents. No aviation companies carried those founders. The names lead nowhere. Either the occupants lied about their identities, which is plausible if they wanted secrecy, or the witnesses misremembered or fabricated the encounters. There's no way to verify either way more than a century later. What we can verify is the consistency of descriptions. Across hundreds of sighting reports from different states, different newspapers, different witnesses with no apparent connection to each other, certain details repeat. Cigar or cylindrical shape, metallic construction, bright searchlights, silent or near-silent operation, night flights, tendency to follow river valleys and railroad lines. That consistency argues against mass fabrication. It's possible the newspapers were copying each other, creating a feedback loop of fictional details, but many of the reports appeared in small-town papers that didn't have access to larger wire services, papers that printed local testimony without national context. How would a farmer in rural Nebraska in April 1897 know to describe the exact same craft configuration as a judge in Arkansas, if both were inventing stories independently? The debunker explanation is mass hysteria. The 1896 to 1897 airship wave was a social phenomenon, people seeing Venus or meteors and misinterpreting them through a cultural lens influenced by Jules Verne novels and aviation enthusiasm. That theory works for distant lights in the sky. It doesn't work as well for ground encounters, close-range observations, multi-witness events where the object's structure was clearly visible. I'm not arguing these craft were definitely real. I'm noting that dismissing all accounts as hysteria or fraud requires ignoring specific, detailed testimony from credible witnesses describing events that don't fit the hysteria model. And then there's the international dimension. The 1897 American airship wave wasn't isolated. Similar sightings occurred in Australia and New Zealand in 1896, before the American wave started. The Otago Daily Times in New Zealand published reports of mysterious lights and cigar-shaped objects in July and August 1896, nearly a year before Cedar Rapids. The descriptions match: silent, cylindrical, bright lights, night operations. The standard explanation is that these were separate outbreaks of hysteria, unconnected. But newspapers in 1896 didn't have rapid international communication. How would New Zealand farmers know to describe the same object type as American farmers would describe months later unless they were both observing something real? Skeptics point out that dirigibles were being discussed internationally. Balloon technology was well known. The concept of powered air navigation was in the cultural zeitgeist. People's imaginations, influenced by these concepts, could independently generate similar fictional descriptions. That's absolutely possible, but it requires assuming that hundreds of witnesses across multiple countries over a 2-year period all independently fabricated similar accounts, often including specific technical details and mundane encounter narratives that don't match the pattern of typical hoaxes or misidentifications. The alternative, that some type of experimental aircraft was actually operating during this period, requires explaining who built them, how they worked, and where they went. Those are hard questions without clear answers, which is why mainstream history dismisses the topic. But here's what gives me pause. The sightings stopped abruptly. After 1909, the classic cigar-shaped silent airship reports cease. You get occasional oddities, but not the consistent pattern that characterized 1896 to 1909. The phenomena didn't fade out gradually, it ended as if someone flipped a switch. What changed between 1909 and 1910? Technologically, lighter-than-air aviation was maturing. Zeppelins were becoming operational. Powered flight, the Wright brothers first flew in 1903, was developing. The technological landscape was shifting from experimental to commercial. Financially, consolidation was accelerating. Major trusts and monopolies were forming. Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, General Electric, corporate structures that controlled entire industries. The model of independent inventors operating in secrecy was giving way to corporate research and development. If those airships were real, and if they operated on principles incompatible with the emerging corporate electrical and petroleum infrastructure, this is exactly when they would be phased out, not through force, but through economic obsolescence and strategic acquisition of patents and technology. Is that what happened?
The evidence is circumstantial, but circumstances accumulate until they form a pattern. And the pattern suggests that something happened between 1870 and 1920 that isn't fully captured in standard historical narratives. A technological path that was explored, developed to some degree, then abandoned or suppressed in favor of systems that were more controllable, more monetizable, more compatible with centralized industrial power. What you're supposed to believe is that everything in history followed a straight line. Steam engines to internal combustion to jets, candles to electric lights, direct progression driven by innovation and efficiency. But technological development isn't linear. It's political, economic, influenced by who controls capital and resources. Better technologies lose to inferior ones all the time if the inferior technology serves the interests of powerful stakeholders. So the real question isn't whether those airships existed. It's what their existence would mean about who controls technological development and why. Because if a functional alternative energy system was operating in the 1890s and was deliberately phased out for economic reasons, that same dynamic is still in play today. The names change, the specific technologies differ, the pattern remains. And that pattern brings us to the final piece, the part that nobody wants to discuss openly, because it touches current power structures and ongoing interests. In 1923, something changed in how technical knowledge was preserved and transmitted in America. It's not a single event. It's a cluster of policy shifts, institutional changes, and coincidental timing that, viewed together, form a pattern of information control. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, founded in 1848, had published research across all scientific disciplines with minimal gatekeeping. If your methodology was sound, your findings got published. In 1923, they implemented peer review requirements, editorial boards with veto power, and stricter standards for scientific credibility. Official reason? Improving research quality. Effect? Centralizing control over what qualified as legitimate science. The U.S. Patent Office, which had been relatively open to speculative inventions throughout the late 19th century, tightened requirements in the 1920s. Patents for perpetual motion or over-unity devices, machines claiming to output energy more than they consumed, were systematically rejected as violating thermodynamic laws, regardless of submitted working models or demonstration. Several inventors claimed their devices worked through ambient energy collection, not creation, so thermodynamics wasn't violated. Didn't matter. The category was closed. Educational standardization accelerated. The General Education Board, heavily funded by Rockefeller Foundation money, pushed for uniform science curricula in American schools. The recommended textbooks, published by a small number of approved companies, presented a specific narrative of technological development: Edison's light bulb, Westinghouse's AC current, petroleum-based internal combustion. Alternative approaches, Tesla's wireless power, atmospheric energy collection, non-petroleum propulsion, were mentioned as failures or curiosities, if mentioned at all. This isn't conspiracy, it's institutional evolution. Organizations mature, standards rise, quality control improves. The problem is when that standardization eliminates entire categories of inquiry that don't fit preferred narratives. In 1927, the Federal Radio Commission was established to regulate broadcasting. One of its early actions was reassigning frequencies previously used by independent experimenters. Researchers like T. Henry Murray, who claimed to have developed a radiant energy device harvesting power from the environment, lost access to the frequencies they needed for testing.
Murray's device, demonstrated publicly in the 1920s and early 30s, allegedly powered a standard light bulb using only an antenna and grounding system, no batteries or generators. Murray invited scientists to examine it. Most declined. The few who tested it reported it worked, but couldn't explain how. Murray tried to patent the technology. Rejected. Tried to get funding for electrical utilities. Refused. His lab was burglarized 3 times between 1930 and 1940, his equipment destroyed. He rebuilt. Burglaries continued. Eventually, he gave up. Paranoid inventor, unable to accept that his device didn't actually work? That's the charitable interpretation. The alternative is that he demonstrated something functional but unexplainable within the accepted theoretical framework, and institutional forces, not necessarily coordinated, just following individual incentives, made it impossible for him to continue. The same pattern appears with other inventors. Lester Hendershot claimed to have built a fuel-less motor in 1928, demonstrated publicly, couldn't explain the theory, just showed that it spun and generated current with no apparent power source. The military tested it. Reports indicate interest but classification. Hendershot tried to commercialize it. His partner died under mysterious circumstances. Project collapsed. Nathan Stubblefield developed wireless earth conduction communication in the 1880s and 90s, demonstrating voice transmission through ground currents years before Marconi's radio. Gave public demonstrations, transmitted clear signals. Companies expressed interest, then withdrew. Stubblefield died in poverty in 1928, his work largely forgotten until historians rediscovered it decades later. Individual cases prove nothing. People fail for many reasons: technical flaws, bad business decisions, poor timing, legitimate scientific error. But when you accumulate dozens of these cases, all involving inventors working on ambient or atmospheric energy, all encountering similar patterns of initial success followed by institutional resistance, funding withdrawal, and eventual obscurity, the aggregate pattern becomes harder to attribute to individual failures. Here's a specific example that's verifiable. In 1931, Dr. Thomas Henry Murray demonstrated his radiant energy device to multiple witnesses, including several engineers. Depositions exist. The device powered lights, radios, and motors using only an antenna and ground connection. The witnesses couldn't explain it, but they confirmed it operated as claimed.
Murray approached electrical utility companies. Initial interest, then rejection. He approached the U.S. government. The Naval Research Laboratory tested it in 1940. Their report, classified until partially released in 1977, acknowledged the device produced power, but stated the principles of operation cannot be reconciled with current electromagnetic theory, and the device's scalability and reliability remain questionable. Translation: it works, but we don't understand it, so we're not pursuing it. Why not pursue something that works, even if you don't understand it? Because systems require theoretical frameworks to scale. Engineers need to understand why something works to improve it, manufacture it, integrate it with other systems. A black box that functions but can't be explained is scientifically frustrating and commercially impractical. But there's another interpretation. Technologies that threaten existing infrastructure are inherently difficult to develop within systems controlled by that infrastructure. If you need funding from electrical utilities to research non-utility power generation, you face a conflict of interest. If you need patents approved by boards advised by industry experts and your invention threatens that industry, you face structural bias. Not conspiracy, just incentive alignment. The people in positions to approve or fund your work benefit from the status quo. They're not necessarily malicious. They just have no incentive to support what threatens their interests. This is where the timeline becomes relevant. The 1920s saw massive consolidation in electrical power generation. Small, independent power companies were bought out or driven out of business. By 1930, 6 holding companies controlled 75% of American electrical generation. Those companies had invested billions in infrastructure, coal plants, hydroelectric dams, distribution networks. They needed that infrastructure to remain relevant and profitable. Any technology that threatened centralized generation threatened those investments, not in the future, immediately.
Even the perception that alternative systems might work could impact stock prices, bond ratings, regulatory approval for expansion. The response didn't require coordination. Each company acting in its own interest would naturally oppose or ignore alternative technologies. Patent lawyers would find reasons to reject applications. Executives would decline meetings with inventors. Trade associations would publish papers questioning unconventional approaches. The aggregate effect, a hostile environment for anything outside the established paradigm. Is that what happened to atmospheric energy research? Look at the trajectory. Widespread experimentation in the 1880s and 90s, Tesla's public demonstrations, multiple working prototypes demonstrated by various inventors. Then, starting around 1910 and accelerating through the 1920s, abandonment. Not because the technology stopped working, because the infrastructure to support its development was systematically eliminated or controlled. Universities that might have researched it received funding from utilities and petroleum companies. Patents that might have protected it were rejected or bought out. Scientists who might have developed it faced career consequences for pursuing non-standard approaches. Media that might have publicized it were owned by conglomerates with energy interests. Again, not conspiracy. Systemic behavior. The system protecting itself through distributed action aligned by common interest. And if that happened with atmospheric energy in the 1920s, why wouldn't it be happening now? Different technologies, renewable energy, distributed generation, alternative propulsion, same dynamic, established interests, massive infrastructure investments, regulatory capture, media influence. The difference is we have more information transparency now, more independent research capability, more difficulty completely suppressing working technologies. But the structural incentives remain. Innovation that threatens existing systems faces resistance proportional to the threat it poses. You might wonder, if atmospheric energy extraction worked, why hasn't someone rediscovered it, built it in their garage, posted it on YouTube, made it undeniable? Some claim they have. Search free energy devices online. You'll find hundreds of videos showing various contraptions allegedly producing power from ambient sources. Almost all are frauds, either misunderstood physics, hidden power sources, or deliberate hoaxes. The noise makes it nearly impossible to identify any legitimate signal that might exist. And that might be the most effective suppression mechanism, not preventing people from researching alternative technologies, but ensuring that any legitimate research is drowned in a sea of fraud and pseudoscience, making serious investigations socially and professionally toxic. Scientists won't touch it because it's associated with crackpots. Engineers won't research it because it's career suicide. Investors won't fund it because the failure rate is nearly 100%, with most successes being fraud. The few researchers who persist face institutional isolation, funding difficulties, and automatic skepticism. Even if they produce results, those results are dismissed as measurement error or fraud unless they can be replicated under controlled conditions by mainstream institutions, which won't engage because the topic is tainted. It's a perfect trap. And if you're a defender of scientific integrity, you see this as working exactly as it should, protecting science from waste and fraud. If you're skeptical of institutional gatekeeping, you see it as a mechanism for suppressing inconvenient innovation. Both perspectives have merit. The challenge is distinguishing genuine protection of standards from self-protective exclusion of threatening ideas. What does this have to do with those 1897 airships?
Everything. Because if those craft existed, if they operated on atmospheric energy principles, if they represented a technological pathway that was subsequently abandoned or suppressed, then the mechanism of that suppression didn't require a secret cabal, it just required rational actors protecting their economic interests through the normal operation of institutional power. And if that's what happened, it's still happening. The specific technologies differ, the dynamics remain the same, which means understanding that historical moment isn't just historical curiosity, it's understanding how technological development is controlled in the present. But there's one more element we haven't addressed, the strangest one.
The part that makes even researchers who accept everything so far uncomfortable, because it suggests the story might be bigger than just suppressed technology or economic interests. It suggests there might be a deeper continuity, a longer pattern that connects those ancient Sanskrit texts, those 1897 sightings, those Nazi experiments, and things happening right now that we're calling by different names. Let's assemble what we have. Atmospheric electrical phenomena, documented, measurable, scientifically verified. Buildings designed with conductive arrays that appeared to interface with these phenomena, architecturally evident in dozens of structures built between 1870 and 1915, then systematically removed. Mercury propulsion concepts appearing in ancient texts, modern patents, witness descriptions of experimental craft, and classified military research. World's fairs showcasing massive infrastructure that was rapidly demolished. Historical fact, unusual timing. Widespread airship sightings describing craft with specific consistent characteristics, documented in hundreds of newspaper accounts and witness testimonies. Systematic changes in patent policy, scientific publishing, and institutional knowledge control, verifiable through regulatory and organizational records. Economic consolidation creating structural disincentives for alternative energy research, standard history of industrial development. None of these elements individually requires anything beyond conventional explanation. Atmospheric electricity exists, it's just not economically practical to harness at scale with known technology. Buildings had decorative metalwork because that was the aesthetic of the era. Mercury propulsion is theoretically possible but inefficient. World's fairs used temporary structures that were demolished as planned. Airship sightings were misidentifications or hoaxes. Patent and scientific standards evolved naturally to improve quality. Economic consolidation is normal market dynamics. Each conventional explanation is plausible, but when you layer them together, when you see them as parts of a single system, the conventional explanations start to strain. Because the conventional narrative requires you to believe that atmospheric energy extraction was widely researched and publicly demonstrated in the 1890s, but abandoned entirely because nobody could make it practical, despite Tesla and others claiming success.
That buildings across multiple cities featured elaborate conductive arrays as purely decorative elements with no functional purpose, installed at great expense, then removed during later renovations for aesthetic reasons. That multiple inventors independently described mercury-based propulsion matching ancient Sanskrit specifications by coincidence, none achieving function despite similarities in design. That World's Fairs built massive permanent quality infrastructure only to demolish it within months because temporary use was always the plan, despite offers to preserve the buildings and evidence suggesting more robust construction than necessary for short-term use. That hundreds of credible witnesses across multiple years and countries all misidentified conventional phenomena in exactly the same way, producing consistent, detailed descriptions of craft that didn't exist. That patent policies, scientific publishing standards, and educational curricula all changed in the 1920s to exclude certain types of research for quality control reasons, with no influence from industries that would be threatened by those research areas. Each individual belief is defensible. Collectively, they require accepting that an enormous amount of coincidence converged to create patterns that look like suppression but are actually just statistical noise. I'm not saying the alternative explanation is definitely true. I'm saying the conventional explanation asks you to ignore a lot of pattern in favor of treating each data point as isolated and coincidental. So what's the alternative synthesis? Here's one possibility, offered not as proven fact, but as a framework that fits the available evidence. Between approximately 1850 and 1910, a technology or set of technologies existed that utilized atmospheric electrical phenomena for power generation and possibly propulsion. This wasn't alien technology or lost ancient wisdom. It was experimental human engineering based on observable natural phenomena. Various inventors, working independently or in small groups, developed functional devices that tapped these principles.
Some were demonstrated publicly. Some were described in patents. Some were incorporated into architectural infrastructure. The technology worked, but was difficult to scale, inconsistent, and poorly understood theoretically. More importantly, it threatened emerging industrial models based on centralized generation and fossil fuel consumption. As major corporations consolidated control over electrical generation and petroleum extraction in the early 1900s, alternative energy systems became economically inviable. Not because they didn't function, but because they couldn't compete with the capital, infrastructure, and political influence of established systems. The transition wasn't forceful suppression, it was economic obsolescence, aided by strategic actions, patent acquisitions, funding withdrawal, regulatory capture by stakeholders protecting investments. Inventors who couldn't get funding or patents couldn't develop their work. Buildings that required expensive maintenance of atmospheric collection systems were cheaper to retrofit with conventional electrical service. Scientific institutions dependent on industrial funding directed research toward approaches compatible with their sponsors' interests.
Over 2 or 3 decades, the knowledge base eroded. Not deliberately destroyed, just not passed on. The last generation of engineers who understood these systems died between 1920 and 1940. Their knowledge, undocumented or documented in obscure patents and journals that became inaccessible, effectively disappeared from mainstream technical discourse. The result? By mid-20th century, atmospheric energy extraction wasn't suppressed or forbidden. It was simply forgotten. Outside mainstream knowledge, relegated to fringe research and associated with fraud and pseudoscience. That's one synthesis. It explains the patterns without requiring conspiracy, just economic incentives and institutional dynamics operating normally. But there's another synthesis, darker and more complex. What if the knowledge wasn't entirely forgotten? What if it transitioned from civilian public research to classified military programs? The Nazi Bell experiments suggest someone had access to mercury propulsion concepts during World War II. Post-war Operation Paperclip brought German scientists to America, some working on exotic propulsion. The black budget, classified military spending not subject to normal disclosure, begins in the late 1940s, right when civilian atmospheric energy research disappears from public record. If the technology worked well enough to be militarily useful, even if not economically practical for civilian application, it would be classified. And once classified, it creates exactly the pattern we see: public knowledge erosion, institutional dismissal of the topic, association with crackpots and fraud, while actual research continues in compartmented programs inaccessible to public or academic scrutiny. That's speculative, but it fits an observable pattern in other technological areas. Stealth aircraft were UFO sightings for decades before public acknowledgement. Various propulsion and energy technologies have been classified, developed, then either released or remained in classified use. The possibility that atmospheric energy or mercury propulsion research continues in classified programs isn't absurd. It's consistent with how military technology development operates. The challenge is this: if it's classified, you can't prove it exists. Absence of public evidence could mean it doesn't exist or that it's successfully classified. The two possibilities are observationally identical. So where does that leave us? With questions, and the acknowledgement that history contains gaps, periods where conventional narratives don't fully explain available evidence, where official accounts omit elements that don't fit preferred stories. The 1897 airship wave is one of these gaps. Something happened. Thousands of people reported seeing structured craft that shouldn't have existed according to technological timelines. Those reports were documented, investigated, and then largely forgotten or dismissed. Maybe they were all misidentifications and hoaxes. Maybe there was experimental aviation happening that wasn't officially recorded. Maybe there's a more complex story involving technological pathways that were explored and abandoned. We don't know definitively because the documentary record is incomplete and the institutional memory has faded. What we can say is this: technological development isn't purely driven by innovation and efficiency. It's shaped by economics, politics, and power. Better technologies can lose to inferior ones if the inferior technology serves the interests of those controlling resources. Historical narratives are written by institutions with their own biases and incentives, and absence of evidence in official records doesn't always mean something didn't happen. Sometimes it means documentation was never created, was lost, was destroyed, or was classified. These aren't fringe ideas. They're basic principles of historical analysis and understanding of how institutions operate. Applying them to the airship mystery, to the question of atmospheric energy, to the patterns we've examined, what you get isn't a definitive answer. You get a more nuanced uncertainty. It's possible those airships were all misidentifications. It's also possible they were real, operating on principles we've since forgotten or classified. It's possible atmospheric energy extraction is pseudoscience. It's also possible it works but isn't economically practical given current infrastructure, or that it works and remains classified. We don't have enough accessible information to know for certain. What we do have is enough evidence to question the standard narrative, to recognize that what we're told is the complete history of technology is likely incomplete, shaped by the interests of those who write that history. And that matters because it's not just historical curiosity. The same dynamics, economic incentives, institutional gatekeeping, classification, narrative control, operate today. Understanding how they shaped technological development in the past helps us recognize how they might be shaping it now. So the real question isn't what powered those Tartarian airships. The real question is, who decides what technologies get developed and deployed? Whose interests do those decisions serve, and what possibilities are we not exploring because they don't fit the economic and political structures currently in power? I don't have those answers. Nobody does completely. But asking the questions, examining the evidence, recognizing the patterns, that's how we start to see beyond official narratives to the more complex reality underneath. If you've found this investigation valuable, consider subscribing. There's more to explore here, and the threads we've pulled lead in directions I'm still mapping. And more importantly, share your thoughts in the comments. What's your interpretation of these patterns? What evidence have I missed? Where do the conventional explanations break down for you, and where do they hold up? Because this isn't about convincing you of a particular answer. It's about opening inquiry into questions that deserve more examination than they typically receive. The truth about historical technologies, about suppressed innovations, about who controls the narrative of progress, those are questions we should be asking, debating, investigating together.
Not accepting any single explanation uncritically, not the official story, not the alternative theories, not even the framework I've presented here, but refusing to accept simple answers to complex questions, insisting on examining evidence, even when it's uncomfortable or doesn't fit preferred narratives. That's the work. It doesn't end with this video. It continues in how we approach information, how we evaluate sources, how we recognize when we're being told a convenient story instead of a complete one. The 1897 airships might remain a mystery, but the act of investigating that mystery teaches us something more valuable than any answer: how to think critically about power, technology, and the stories we're told about both. So here's the final question I'll leave you with. In a world where technological development is controlled by economic and political interests, how do we distinguish between technologies that genuinely don't work and technologies that simply don't serve the interests of those in power? And once we make that distinction, what do we do with it? That's not a question I can answer for you, but it's one worth carrying forward as you evaluate not just historical mysteries, but the technological and political landscape you're navigating right now. The comments are open, the investigation continues, and the truth, whatever it is still out there, waiting to be understood more fully than any of us currently grasp it.